Pierce, and I'm a personal trainer and a Pilates instructor. And today I'm going to go over some form tips to help improve your hip bridge exercise. It's sometimes called a shoulder bridge or a glute bridge. First tip, you want your heels to be under your knees when you are at the top of the exercise. Now, a general cue that you might hear a lot is you should be able to touch your heels with your fingertips. And that's not necessarily wrong, but depending on your proportions, it might bring your heels in too close. It does for me, okay? So if your heels are closer to your butt than your knees are, you might feel strain across the top of the kneecaps, and that is a sign you need to step them out a little farther. Now, if you have your heels out farther than the knees, that's not wrong, but it is going to shift the muscular emphasis. So if your heels are out farther than your knees, that's going to be a more hamstring dominant exercise. If your heels are right under the knees, that is going to be a more glutes dominant exercise. Unless the instructor specifies that they want you to target the hamstrings, go for heels right under knees. Second tip, still continuing to talk about hamstrings. I want you to notice if when your hips lift up, your body tries to slide back. That could be a sign that your hamstrings are taking over for your glutes. So in that case, it might mean that your heels are out too wide, and bringing them in directly under the knees might help you stay in place. And also just think hips up as you press your feet down into the floor rather than letting yourself slide towards the top of your mat. Tip number 3, you want your rib cage to be gently closed in and down when you are at the top of that bridge position. Yes, we are focusing on the posterior or the back side of our body contracting as we press the hips up, but we need to stay active through the front of our core as well. Now, when you inhale, there is a natural expansion of the rib cage. It's a 3-dimensional expansion, and it's quiet or gentle. If you flare open through the front of the rib cage, that's a little different, and that flaring open is usually associated with a change in the shape of your spine out of neutral. So if we're flaring open through the rib cage and we're kind of extending into the mid-back, then that usually means that we're overarching into our lower back, which we don't want. Instead, we want to maintain more of a neutral alignment through the spine. So we want to avoid that flaring open of the rib cage. We want to think gently in and down, engage through our abdominal wall. So to show you what that looks like, as I lift my hips up, I'm going to exhale. I'm engaged through my core, and at the top of this, my ribs are moving gently in and down. I feel that 360 brace of my abdominal wall. It is not this. Notice how when I let the ribs open, I sink into my lower back. It's this. Speaking of neutral, another really helpful cue can be to think of reaching your tailbone towards your knees as you press the hips up. That helps us come into a neutral pelvic position at the top and avoid having an anterior pelvic tilt at the top of our bridge. So an anterior tilt is when we are kind of shortened through the front of our hip flexors and we have this big excessive arch to our lower back, or your pelvis is tilting forward. Instead, we want neutral. Now, if you lack some strength in the glutes and are tight through the front of your hip flexors, it's easier said than done coming into neutral, and you may find that your body wants to be in this sort of anterior tilted position at the top. So if we think of not just pushing the hip bones up towards the ceiling, but simultaneously reaching our tailbone towards our kneecaps, that's going to help us really fire through the glutes. So I'm open through the front of the hips at the top, active through the glutes, and my pelvis is in this more neutral position as opposed to that anterior tilt. Notice if I'm in the anterior tilt, I'm shortened through or flexed through my hip flexors, and I'm elongated through my glutes. I'm not getting all the power and contraction out of them that I want. Speaking of muscle contraction, I want you to notice where you feel the contraction as you do the exercise. You want to feel it in your glutes, but notice if instead of feeling the glutes contract, you're just feeling your lower back kind of clench into angry fists, okay? That's not what we want. So do a couple reps and just notice, where are you feeling the tension? Where are you feeling the contraction? If all the clenching is in your lower back, there's a good chance you're in that anterior pelvic tilt we were just talking about. Instead, I want you to think, and this is a weird cue, but it helps, think about making fists with your butt cheeks, okay? Not the lower back. So you squeeze into the glutes as you push your feet down into the floor. So at the top, you should feel the contraction here in your butt, not so much here in the lower back. And that's not to say your lower back isn't working, your spinal erectors are, but we just want to shift that focus into glutes and out of lumbar spine. Next, we want to notice what the knees are doing. Now, throughout the range of motion, lifting and lowering the hips, the knees should be stable, they should stay equidistant apart, and they should be pointing straight up to the ceiling. But what often happens, and this happens to me a lot, is you may notice wobbling of the knees as you lift and lower your hips. Now, if you're noticing that wobbling, a couple things could be happening. Typically, if there's wobbling of the knees, we want to look below the joint to the feet and then above the knees to the hips. So with the feet, you want to make sure that you are spread out through the foot, grounded down through it, and that there is equal weight in all three corners of the foot, okay? A stable foot position, grounding down through that big toe and the heel, is going to also help stabilize the knees. The other thing that could be causing wobbling of the knees is imbalances or instabilities within the hip joint, or just differences between right and left. So you may be having a harder time firing the right or the left side glutes versus the other side. If that is the case, what happens is your hips are going to kind of shift over to that dominant side that's firing and then come back through center as you get the hips to the top, and that can create that little shift side to side. Now, differences between right and left are very normal, so it's not the end of the world. If you do notice a little wobbling in the knees as you lift and lower, it's not something to be super concerned of. It's more something I want you to be mindful of because it can signal that there are some imbalances between the sides that you want to continue to work on. Now, speaking of this, a great way to address imbalances is to do unilateral exercises where you're focused on just the right or just the left. So here are a couple form tips if we are doing single leg bridge work. First thing, you want to keep both hip bones pointing straight up to the ceiling, equidistant. So what tends to happen is that as one foot lifts off the floor, that hip wants to drop down a little lower. Instead, we want to try to keep the pelvis as level as possible. So a cue that I find really helps with this is as you pick one foot off of the mat, also think of pushing down with the foot that's still on the floor. So there's almost this countering motion. If we start here with both feet down, as I lift one foot up, I'm thinking of pushing the opposite foot down and the hip stays level. What I don't want to happen as you lift the foot up is I don't want that hip to drop down. So think whoop, level hips throughout the movement, and it doesn't matter what the variation is. Maybe we have our legs straight, bent, maybe we're lifting and lowering, maybe we're shifting the leg out to the side, both hip bones, same distance from the ceiling. And final tip with this is that you want to keep equal length through both sides of your waist. Now I'm cueing equal length through both sides of the waist, but what I really care about is the position of the pelvis. If you are hiking one hip up, then notice this side of my waist is shortened, this is lengthened. I want both to be equal distance. So think of reaching the tops of your hips towards your knees and maintain that length even as we remove one foot or the other. Notice as the foot comes up, do you have the tendency to hike that hip up towards your ribs? Don't do it. Long waist. So when we put that all together, we have heels under knees, arms are down by the sides for support, and as we press the hips up, we're being mindful of not flaring open through the rib cage. We are firing through our glutes, reaching the tailbone towards our knees so that we maintain neutral. We're grounded down through the feet to help support our knees and prevent wobbling. We're being mindful of not moving our body back, instead firing through the glutes and lifting the hips straight up. And if we remove a foot and do some unilateral work, we're thinking hip bones equidistant to the ceiling and length through both sides of the waist. So I hope those tips are helpful. We see this exercise a lot throughout all the workouts and classes that I share here on YouTube, and I try to drop in some of those tips every time this exercise comes up. but I also think it's helpful to just break it down in a separate video as well. If you have any questions about this exercise, leave them below. There are lots of different variations within hip bridge, so different tips will apply depending on the variations that you're doing, but these are sort of the general form cues that I really think help regardless of the variation of the exercise you're doing. All right, hope that was helpful.